爵士乐。那我叫 Andrew， 我是今天的主持人，还有助手，然后也是翻译家，还有基本上我就是会带动这个活动的。我先介绍一下乐手，钢琴是 Bobby West， 然后萨克斯风是谢明燕，贝斯刘玉佳。好，然后主要其实我今天就被赋予几个任务，其中一个当然就是让你们品尝到东区粉，大家都有拿到有吃到了哦。然后接下来要带大家认识爵士乐。那这个计划其实是我们后面那位品涵 Heidi， 我们新的那个 Business Development Manager 他的他想的东西。那 Heidi 其实他不是我们爵士圈的人，所以他进来之后帮我们带来一些就是叫旁观者清，就是一般人的概念跟一些认知。所以这个计划其实就是想要让，因为我们做爵士的，就是有时候在台上就是自己爽、自己好玩这样子，可是很少会顾虑到观众到底是听得懂，还是说知道我们在干嘛这样子。所以这个下午我们会一步一步带大家认识一下我们在台上到底是在做什么，然后也要通过我们今天会讲解爵士乐的一些不同的 style。今天特别会 cover 到的，当然是还有一个下礼拜我们还有多一场，然后刚好，所以分2个部分嘛。那今天刚好是后半，有点颠倒过来，但其实也没差，我们保证你们还是听得懂。所以今天会讲到的，特别是 bebop 之后40年代到70年代 bebop、hardbop、bluebop、post bebop， 也就是说 Charlie Parker 到Miles Davis 之后那个时期的音乐这样子。然后最后我最困难的任务应该就是想办法用东区粉圆来解说这个跟爵士乐的那个关联，这个是我自己觉得最有挑战性的东西我觉得这2者到底有什么关系？一当然就是希望用大家熟知的东西来做比喻，对我们做的东西做一些小小的比喻。那我自己是觉得说，不管做什么事情也好，音乐或者是打篮球或者踢足球，其实每一个学问、每一个艺术、每一门领域都是怎么讲？如果我们见到一个大师，像比如说我们爵士乐的大师 Herbie Hancock 或者是 Chick Corea， 你就会发现他们其实都有很高的一个这个是高人。就是我觉得不管哪一个领域都好，其实就是你到了某个 level， 就是你跟这个 universe 是 in tune， 你跟宇宙是同步，就是你看到某一个真理，某一个这个世界运行的方式。那美食我相信也是这样子。那所以我觉得这些领域也都是相关的。好，我会一步一步还有我们也会演奏音乐，所以今天也请你们也是会有一些就是真的音乐，就不只是讲解。那我们第一首歌是 East of the Sun West of the Moon。 Rise of the Moon 呢是一首老歌，所以我们爵士乐其实好，我先回顾一下刚才发生的事情。所以爵士的基本样板其实就是旋律，然后即兴的部分就是大家会轮流 solo， 也就是说刚才我们弹完了一遍旋律之后，刚才是 Bobby 先 solo， 对，钢琴，所以变成是通常节奏组，也就是说我跟玉佳两位都会继续帮他们伴奏，所以刚才是钢琴 solo 完之后换成林燕萨克斯风 solo， 然后刚才结束后变成是贝斯 solo， 然后回到主旋律，所以大家会听到刚才就是回到主旋律，然后就结束。所以爵士乐一般来讲它的进行方式就是这样子，所以我们并不是说很多人会以为说我们反正上去就是想要打什么想要弹什么就可以，其实不是，我们是照着歌曲的进行式在跑。所以即使是钢琴的 solo， 刚才的歌是36小节，所以88812，所以我们一直在轮着这个进行在跑。所以钢琴刚才也是跑一遍等于是一个 chorus， 所以他刚才跑了2遍。所以我们并不是说哦，我已经 solo 完了，我随时都可以交给他 solo， 不是，我们是有一个交接的点。所以他刚才跑了2次，然后明燕也跑了2次，然后玉佳跑了1次，然后我们就回到主旋律这样子。所以这是我们爵士乐的一个共同的默契。所以即便现在，比如说我是跟完全不认识的人来，然后我们弹这首歌，我们第一次没有演奏过，我们也知道这个要做什么事，然后会发生什么事这样子。所以这是我们最基本的一个样板。所以你如果当成是用那个甜食来想的话，这个基础就是像很简单的，就是一个配料，然后冰或者是热的这样子。这个是古早味，如果你现在去东区美，你会看到一个板说哇，他们的料有可以加蒟蒻啊，然后那些草这么长一个，所以很古早味的时候其实就是很简单的。然后刚才这首歌来自于那个他们叫做 The Great American Songbook， 也就是说爵士乐大家都知道是黑人的音乐，对不对？但其实它是在美国，非洲文化跟西洋文化碰撞在一起的时候产生出来的一个 art form。然后很多歌曲其实是怎么说，是当时的流行音乐，也就是说当时美国有一个 Tin Pan Alley 那边为了音乐剧写出了很多的歌曲，所以这些歌很多是起初是为了歌手，就是有歌词，然后像 Autumn Leaves 这些 There'll Never Be Another You， 这些都是很经典的一些vocal song， 但是后来就被爵士乐拿去演奏，变成 instrumental 的版本，或者是变成国际的版本。所以我们做的东西其实跟那个历史是有一个连接。I was just telling them how the songs that we do came from, a lot of them came from
the popular song
yeah,
of the day.
popular song of the day. 然后很多的那个 songwriter 其实，所以这样讲可能不知道 Bobby 会不会认同。我觉得白人还是对这个音乐有一些 input 的，因为那时候很多的那些歌曲都是白人写的，像 Cole Porter、Irving Berlin、George Gershwin， 这些都不算是有了，他们可能好像有一些有混血，但是那个是白人的贡献。所以，但是发展这个艺术的确实是 African American。好，那 shall we move on to the bebop style?
Okay.
You wanna tell them a bit about the history
About
bebop, how it came to be?
okay. Well, bebop came to be after the black people of the United States had the blues. They were very depressed. It was a very depressed situation. Out of the blues came something called ragtime, because after the Civil War, in a period they called Reconstruction, German immigrants actually gave black people piano lessons. And in doing so, they introduced the piano music, or the music in general, of Europe. So these German immigrants taught newly freed slaves about Mozart and Beethoven and Chopin. And one of these young, newly freed slaves was a man named Scott Joplin, who called the Entertainer. That came from him studying Chopin with European immigrants. And you would, with Chopin, just kind of devise ragtime out of that. And that led to the very origins of what they call jazz. Jazz came from ragtime, blues. Around the turn of the century, the music was referred to as jazz. And jazz had become so popular by 1910, 1915. They figured that this music was so popular, you could actually make money from it. The first recordings of jazz, there weren't black people. If you look for the first jazz recordings, they're not black people. They were white musicians who had figured out jazz made money. And so sometimes they refer to it as traditional jazz. But there was a problem there, but nobody could say anything about it. During the late 1920s and the early part of the Depression, there was music called swing music. Everybody had to learn to swing because the Depression was so depressing. So there was this swing music. The individual that popularized George Gershwin and his famous George Gershwin, who was from Russian Jewish ancestry, but this is most certainly black blues. People had the blues, and so that music made George Gershwin a star. He was a very, very talented individual. But there were always some questions, but nobody could ask those questions. It wasn't politically correct. But that music was popularized by a guy called Paul Whiteman. Interesting name, Paul Whiteman. And Terry, they call him the King of Jazz.
Yes, yeah.
That was kind of strange.
他是一个就是指挥，然后 composer and conductor， 他就是把很多就是当时可能就是
High Society Jazz，
就是当时的一些 OK 爵士，比如说爵士是黑人演奏的，就是在小交演奏不太有人知道，但他把它就是 they took the song of the people often play and bring it to the like a big stage concert hall and play by the famous musicians. Yeah, made it famous.
Yes.
Made it really popular, like a stage-wide.
He was a large white man. The King of Jazz, I mean, a lot of us couldn't understand that, but nobody could say anything. And that led to the swing music that was an instant hit, because it was a big deal when the Americans got through with the Great Depression. It was like a happy day that was over with. And so swing music was the music that accompanied this victory over this depression. And then suddenly that was the king of swing. Want to tell them who it was, Terry?
King, Benny Goodman.
Benny Goodman. Not really, but he was marketed as the king. Are you following me now?
他现在解释就是因为我们要讲的是
Yeah.
We were trying to talking about like a bebop.
Well, we went
but
from
Bobby's
bebop
like kind of
to
explain
the swing.
the thing happening before. 就是
Yeah.
他在解释，就是大概的解释前面这段历史。
The first jazz recordings were not from black people. That came later. The king of jazz, Paul Whiteman, he wasn't really. It was more like Duke Ellington, actually. But nobody could say that. And then when Benny Goodman became the king of swing, people almost were ready to say something, because the bands of Count Basie, Duke Ellington, Benny Moten, Jimmy Lunceford, Billy Eckstine were really great jazz orchestras. But Benny Goodman was the king of swing. Then there was the war in 1941. Everybody had to go fight. Movie stars, record stars, I mean, everybody had to go. Glenn Miller, he had to go and fight in Europe or in Southeast Asia. The only men that were left were drug addicted black artists in New York City. Suddenly, Thelonious Monk didn't go to the Army. Dizzy, Charlie Parker, Lester Young, they didn't go to the Army. And there was nobody around to suppress them. So I believe they said, let's create some music that they can't play. We're going to devise something that is very complex, extremely technical, and as soon as you can figure out the theory and the harmonics, as soon as you can figure out what's happening with the harmonic sense of this bebop, then we're going to play it really, really fast. Because it was something after that history, after blues, jazz, swing, and the king of swing, and the king of jazz, you guys know who the king of rock and roll was? That came later, that was Elvis Presley. But not really. But anyway, they decided to come up with something. There was no one around to stop them. So Dizzy Gillespie, the pianist Thelonious Monk, and a genius from Kansas City named Charlie Parker devised a music that they called bebop. And they devised this music saying it, unlike swing, unlike blues, unlike ragtime, it's not for dancing. This music is our protest music. This music is ours. They're over fighting Hitler right now, and it's just us up here in Harlem. And we want to devise a music that is ours, and music that they can't take away from us. Or if they do, it won't be easy. And they call the music bebop. Highly complex variations on the same pop songs, the same popular songs they used in swing, and to a lesser degree in the blues. The same popular themes they devised the bebop technique over, but it was very, very technical and had to be played very, very fast. And a person who excelled at this, and we're still trying to figure it out today, was a man named Charles Christopher Parker, and they called him Bird. Okay? Hope I didn't take too much time. He warned me, he said, man, you can't just talk forever.
我快速翻译一下好了。刚才
I'd be interested to know if there are any questions.
Yeah, maybe let me translate what you just said first.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just to make sure everyone's on the same page. So 刚才快速的讲一下爵士乐的历史，是从那个黑人开始接触到这些西洋乐器，慢慢的把蓝调放进去，然后慢慢发展。然后有一段时期其实就是被白人拿去赚钱，拿去当一个就是 show business， 就是像刚才他在讲的那些 Paul Whiteman 啊 Benny Goodman， 他们都是明星，他们是很大，可是他们是白人，他们仗着 jazz 的名号。然后其实上那时候是很流行的 Big Band 大乐团时代，也都是很多白人的音乐家。然后二次大战开始的时候，刚才波比是说，很多人都去被拉去打仗，但是政府就是因为那时候还是种族歧视， 很多的黑人，他就是刚才 Bobby 可能是开玩笑讲，就是很多那种有毒瘾的那些黑人，然后就被
体检没有过，
就没有过，或者是他们就是没有从军这样子。那这些人就静静的在纽约，就是像刚才他讲的那些人 ，Charlie Parker、Dizzy Gillespie、Thelonious Monk， 这些人就慢慢的在那边，因为那时候也没什么工作，他们就算是一个 revolution， 就是
就想要做一些，有点像是做一些革命
性的东西。
对啊，就是发展出一些
对。然后他们同时也生气，说这些白人拿我们的东西去赚钱，然后说是自己的，那他们就故意把这些音乐弄得和弦弄得非常的就是 advanced 很复杂，然后弹很快很快。他就说你们有种就你们可以的话就跟上来，就是有一种像说是挑拨的意思。Yep， 小飞到哪里
It sounded different when you said it.
Really? It's the same thing.
You added some stuff.
No, I just make it faster.
So we,
So that's
like you said, gotta leave.
yeah, no.
On the side. Yeah. 1, 2, 3, 4.
就是刚才讲的，他们很多就以很快的速度在演奏这些音乐，所以就算以现代的人来讲 ，Bebop 还是算是难度非常非常高的一个音乐类型。Would you say that I'll just end up that even today, the term bebop implies a very high degree of difficulty.
It will always be that way.
Yeah, and then the term died out somewhere. It got popular, but then
The war ended 1945. All the soldiers came back home and became regular people again. And they were like saying, what is this? Soldiers had been gone for so long. It was such a tragic period. People wanted to dance and hold one another. People didn't want to hear anything this nervous. The music sounded very nervous to them. And the war was over and America win, so they say. And the style had about 3 years of popularity. And then it continued on for another 3 or 4 years, but only for the die-hard fans. One of the architects of this music was Dizzy Gillespie. And his protege, how do you say that in Chinese? Protege.
徒弟
Was a guy named Miles Davis. Miles had become a star, even though he had big difficulties with bebop from the very beginnings. He was a very young man. The music was very technical. He struggled to play it. And when you had people around like Dizzy, Fats Navarro, Clifford Brown, he knew that he was never going to outplay these guys playing this highly influential and symbolic music. So, incidentally, Thelonious Monk was one of the people that's credited for like inventing bebop with Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie, and drummer Kenny Clark. But Monk, being the kind of strange man he was, he pretty much abandoned bebop and spent the rest of his life writing and performing monk music. And if you know anything about Monk's music, it was never this fast. In the meanwhile, Miles had hooked up with a genius music theorist and orchestra leader named Gil Evans. Miles pretty much got lost in the late 40s and the early 50s, kind of abandoned bebop. There was a young kid named Clifford Brown that showed up. And Miles said, you know what, I think I'm gonna play something else. Because Clifford, he popularized the song that we just played called Donna Lee. This is like, it never gets simple. Still, you have to struggle to play it. Miles had hooked up with Gil Evans, and they came up with an idea to slow everything down. Because that's what happened after the war was over. People were happy, families were reunited, soldiers were heroes, and it was time for a change. And my goodness, let's relax. So Miles and Gil Evans devised a way to slow the music down to where it wouldn't make people nervous and it wouldn't fly over the heads of people who they needed to buy records. So they slowed down the tempo, but they retained the advanced harmonies and then called it cool jazz. I think maybe in 1949 that was their way of saying bebop slowed down so it won't make you feel so nervous. But at the same time, it retained the advanced harmonies, the complex rhythms, and some of the other virtues of what bebop was. But it was slowed down to where you can actually hear everything, you can hear the notes, you can actually hum along. And it was an instant hit. Instant hit. Bebop had struggled to exist. Incidentally, during the war times, they had something called a recording ban. They couldn't make records because they needed all the materials to go to the war effort. They even stopped making coins from 1941 until 1945. It's very difficult to find like pennies or nickels or quarters from 1941 to 1945 because everything went towards the war effort. There was a ban on recording. So you see what happened to bebop? I mean, bebop really didn't have a chance. And the record labels that distributed the music of Charlie Parker and Dizzy during that time were very small, independent labels that didn't last as long as the whole movement did. I mean, you know, Bird was on Savoy Records and Dial in LA. And they didn't last for no more than 1 or 2 LPs from each artist. In the meantime, Miles hooked up with the brilliant Gil Evans and this idea about cool jazz. And their first record was on Capitol Records. That's a huge label even today. So that was an instant hit, and we have an example of that music. It's bop, same sensibilities, same advanced harmonies, same complex rhythmic figures, but slowed down to where people can hear it and hum along. And I think that's one of the reasons why it was a big success. And that, the best example of that is a song made popular from that first record, a song called Boplicity. Notice he kept the bop in there to let you know that the music was derived from bebop, but now it's different.
I believe it's come from simplicity.
Yes.
Simplicity.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
就爵士有很多小故事，如果大家有兴趣可以。
Bop simplified.
Yeah, so please.
Want to try, gentlemen?
Hold on, let me translate.
Oh, okay.
Translate first before I forgot. 所以刚才 Bobby 讲的 ，bebop 就是一个小小的 movement， 因为就像大家刚才听的，他没办法跳舞，这不是在那之前爵士乐是就是 popular music， 所以是哪来一个跳舞的？可是 bebop 完全就是艺术家的一种革命的一个 movement， 所以他没办法跳舞，所以他其实除了一些粉丝跟音乐圈自己喜欢，就是有吹奏的人来讲，他都很喜欢。可是，一般人根本从打仗回来之后，当那个经济开始又在滚动的时候，他们想要听的是不一样的东西。所以 bebop 从来都一直都是一个小小的 underground movement。然后呢，刚才 Bobby 讲到，但是爵士往下来的发展跟这个是从 bebop 分源出来的。那时候有一个叫 Miles Davis， 这大家应该都听过，算是爵士乐最有名的一个音乐家。那他是 Dizzy Gillespie 的，算是把他带，就是很崇拜 Dizzy Gillespie， 然后一直跟着他跑，然后是他的算是小徒弟这样子。然后他是一个很重要的角色，因为他连接。他刚夏伯跟他讲，他去找一位叫 Gil Evans 的那个 composer， 然后他们设计好一个想要把 bebop 这个东西改造成、包装成一般人比较可以接触的音乐风格。So you were saying that it's because of the party Miles couldn't keep up.
Right.
所以像那时候那个年代很多很厉害的小号手，Clifford Brown 啊 ，Fats Navarro 这些，其实是比 Miles 吹的还要厉害的。所以 Miles 有一点就是他想说，这样我没有生存的余地，我要想办法怎么样可以把这个音乐就是改造成符合我自己的。所以往后接下来就变成了一个叫做 cool jazz 的一个小小的 subgenre 这样子。Yeah, Boplicity.
Boplicity.
Thank you.
断之外，还保有，但是还保有 bebop 时期开发出来的那个和弦的复杂度。然后所以可以像大家可以看到的是，鼓跟贝其实从 bebop 时期都还是在做的是一样的东西，就是节奏组目前还没有什么太大的变化，我们还是就是贝还是在 walking， 就是在弹四分音符，然后鼓也是跟着贝一起在打四分音符，然后加一些东西，然后我尽量，但是也没有做得太好，我尽量保持那个年代的那种朴素的打法，但是毕竟还是现代来讲，其实我们现在在弹的时候已经没有特别在想这个是什么时期的什么东西，其实就是就像粉圆他们都配料，就是我们就是把所有的东西都是做出来，但是我跟玉佳都有试图的把它让它是简单化，就是那个时期那个年代的东西。如果说，因为我有就是要把食物跟这个做连结的任务，所以我没有忘记哦，没有忘记。所以如果说 bebop 就是一个新的创新的东西，然后是一个很快很重口味的东西，你可以想象成说，以前如果古早味跟现代的那个甜品来讲，现代的口味绝对是比较重，就是不管是糖水的成分或者是酱汁的那些东西，还有配料也变得比较多、比较复杂，对不对？现在我们一般如果你去什么甜品店，都说多少多少是加3种配料，然后还可以自己选。以前应该就那种老店应该就是你要这个还是这个，就是直接就是给他。I'm just talking about the food stuff.
Okay.
Yeah, you don't need to.
Okay,
Everybody happy. Yeah, 对。然后 Cool Jazz 的时候，基本上就是爵士开始又在流行起来的时候，因为一来是 Miles Davis 这个，他算就是最大的明星，爵士圈最大的一个 superstar， 然后他的参与让这个专辑又开始卖起来，然后像 Bob Marley 这样的歌曲，其实就是听起来比较舒服，比较悦耳熟，也没有太多复杂的东西，然后也不是那种我就是要吹很多音，然后我要显示出我有多厉害，我可以吹这个，然后加这个节奏，就是这很简单，让人容易听懂的东西，所以有点像如果你吃那个东西粉圆，好比讲说爱玉跟仙草这种很柔滑、很温柔的一些配料这样子，这样还可以吧？这样解释。Okay, so next, we're gonna move on to another movement, the hardball.
Yeah, interesting. The one thing about the cool jazz development is something Miles never ever forgot, and it was a pretty simple premise. Most people are not technically advanced jazz musicians, and Miles proved that if you slowed bebop down, it would reach a lot more people. And if it reached a lot more people, you made a lot more money. But not just money, an artist wants to communicate. An artist wants to reach people. No matter how way out and bizarre the art is, what good is the art if you're not reaching people? And this development from bebop to cool jazz, it was just phenomenal how that worked so well. It pretty much set Miles up for life after that. And he never forgot that real simple premise. The music you're doing is interesting, technically advanced, but if you're not reaching people, what are you actually doing? So the term bop was not, some people say bop died the day Charlie Parker did in 1955. But bebop, its best days had already passed about 3 or 4 years before Bird's death. And so they didn't want to retire the name because I'm certain you heard certain elements from bebop in this cool jazz thing, that was a bop device. We call it a flat five. And there's so many other things that they retained from bebop and just slowed it down and sold 1 million copies. There was never 1 million copies of a jazz record ever sold. Miles would do that again later on with his mogul masterpiece, Kind of Blue. But he'd already done that to a lesser degree with the Cool Jazz thing. Cool Jazz reached my home state of California, and the imagery that went with Cool Jazz was very different from the bebop guys. The bebop guys were like black guys with big glasses, with goatee and a cigarette. Very unhealthy image. But with the Cool Jazz, you saw nice looking guys like Chet Baker. They were on the beach, and they were wearing Hawaiian shirts, white pants, and they were there with these drinks, with the umbrellas and these drinks. And it was much more commercial. It was just a huge success. Gil Evans, launched his career doing that, and he had a highly successful career up until the time that he died, a few years before Miles did. In the meantime, people took that premise and said, well, we can still have some respect and dignity for ourselves if we try to reach people. And in all-out effort to reach people, they continued to keep the music slowed down at a pace that people could enjoy, at a tempo that people could hum along. And they devised this music called hard bop. And a lot of that has to go to a very fine pianist and composer by the name of Horace Silver. Horace Silver was a great pianist, composer, orchestrator, and he managed to sell records throughout his life, you know. And that's a very popular thing. It was actually the first song, the first jazz song I ever learned on piano. My uncle Nate taught it to me. And I was so happy because I wanted to be a jazz musician, but McCoy Tyner and Bud Powell and all that bebop was like messing with my mind. I was depressed because I really wanted to be a jazz pianist. But I could do this. That's worth a lot more money than bebop. A lot more money than bebop. And that was the premise of something called hard bop. The great composer Horace Silver. If there's any one person who can be associated with that new industry term, it would be Horace Silver. The music was, once again, retaining elements of bebop, which they still do to this day. What do you think, Terry? They still do to this day. They retain things that came out of bebop. I know, you know, and I mean, they could be in bossa nova, they could be in Jobim tunes, they could be in the stuff that they call fusion. Many great things from bebop are still retained to this day. This way, they combine that with kind of like a dance, kind of an R&B thing. That whole kind of a thing. And Horace Silver was the first cat I ever heard that went. Much like music of Far East, that would be here, where it only used five tones. It's very, very similar to the music. Am I doing a good imitation of Chinese music? You know, we have a lot more things in common than we do differences, because these very same notes there's another name for it. We call it a pentatonic scale, right, Terry? And sometimes we call it a blues scale, because we use those same five tones in a completely different way. Just do the groove too. Pull that in. So, you know, it was all the same thing, but it was really slowed down and people could enjoy it, not just musicians, because us musicians, we'll tell you right now, we don't buy recordings. We don't buy enough to make somebody rich. We are very particular about the music that we buy. You know, I would take $20 and go to a record store and stay there for 3 hours, because I need my $20. But you need everybody to like the music and everybody to support it, and then you turn around and you have another new movement called hard bop. Terry, we talked about why they call it hard.
It's 就
But
是
it's not
这个
hard.
style 叫做 hard bop，是 HARD。那这个字你通常会想到硬，那个 hard solid。
Yeah.
但是它其实是一个不是硬，就是比较是 concentrate， 就是精纯一个比较精实的感觉。就是它像刚刚芭比讲的，就是它其实把前面这些 bebop 或者甚至更早的这些 blues， 然后或者甚至 cool jazz 里面有的这些东西，它都把它融合起来，然后就是产生出来的一种新的 style。那另外一个说法就是 another way to talk about the original hard bop is, for example, like Art Blakey
Mm-hmm.
went to Africa to
Mm-hmm.
find his roots, his ancestors, and then when he come back to the States, he
Mhm.
started to, like his music changed.
Mhm.
He started merging a lot of like African elements. 就
Mm-hmm.
是说，当时的爵士音乐家他们又再回去往，就是在自己的根再次寻找，然后就是他们找到很多讲就是更非洲或更黑人的这些音乐元素，然后那些音乐就是更原始的感觉，就是不难不复杂，然后可是非常的直接 ，it's quite primitive the music.
Yes.
But
Yes.
yeah, it's simple but
Yes.
direct.
Yes.
Yeah, 所以就很强壮的节奏跟很 strong melody and
Yeah.
strong rhythm,
Yes.
but simple. You know?
Simple.
Yeah.
That's the word. That's the operative word.
Mhm.
When you said primitive, you know, primeval, it was not sophisticated. You know, there wasn't room for sophisticated. As a rule, when people dance, they don't like to think, or they don't want the music to force them to think in their middle of a dance. I mean, do that on the next song. But when we're dancing, we really don't need to think. And to try to make them think as they dance, you're not going to be successful. So with that, what you want to do, Andrew?
Moni?
That was when train did take the boat train or
Yeah, we did
sidewinder?
Sure.
Morning.
Morning first.
Morning, yeah, okay. Well,
Talk about Art Blakey.
Yeah. Yeah, you did. Good. There was one thing that I like to retract. When my people were made to be slaves in the 18th, 19th century, the only time where they had to themselves, and the only thing that they were really allowed to do by themselves was go to church. Of course, he gave them the Bible. Here's the Bible. And we want you to study this Bible because you're slaves. We need to civilize you. So study the Bible. And, but no, you can't come to church with us. No. We'll build we'll build a church on the plantation, and then you can go there. The first churches that my ancestors went to were little shacks, little buildings that were built on the plantation. But they were able to go to church, close the door, and it would just be them. And that actually came before the blues. I think the blues came really from that, because then they were able to communicate to one another how difficult it is being a slave. And this music that they inherited from the European church music, they actually put their own personal style into these songs. When I was a kid, we used to do Jesus Christ. And they were taught that. And that was the roots to what we would go on to call gospel, black gospel piano. I was raised in the church, and I was raised by my grandparents, and they had me in church 8 days a week.